For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter of the 352nd Artillery Regiment, the morning began like any other on the Normandy coast. A thin, damp mist hung over the English Channel, muffling the world in a gray stillness. The air was cold, filled with the familiar scent of salt and wet earth. It was just after 5 a.m., another watch, another day of anxious, monotonous waiting. But through his binoculars, as the first hint of dawn tried to break the horizon, the sea began to change. It wasn't the tide, it wasn't a weather front. It was something impossible. A dark line had appeared where sea met sky, a smudge that just kept growing, sharpening, and multiplying. This wasn't a fleet, it was a city of steel, a floating metropolis sailing out of the mist and into history. At that moment, before a single Allied soldier set foot on the beaches below, before the world even knew the name Omaha or Utah, Oberleutnant Richter knew with the cold certainty of a mathematician solving a final terrible equation that the Reich was about to drown. To understand the profound, paralyzing shock of that morning, you have to get inside the mindset of Fortress Europe in the spring of 1944. From the frozen coast of Norway down to the Spanish border, German engineers had spent years constructing the Atlantic Wall. It was conceived as a monumental chain of concrete and steel, bristling with guns, minefields, and obstacles, an impenetrable barrier against any conceivable invasion. In the minds of the German High Command, and in the propaganda fed to the soldiers who manned it, the wall was the ultimate proof of the Reich's enduring power. But Oberleutnant Richter, a professional soldier and a weary veteran of the Eastern Front, knew the difference between propaganda and reality. At 32, he was old enough to remember a different, pre-Nazi Germany, and young enough to have been forged in the furnace of the war. He was pragmatic, observant, and deeply tired. His command was a battery of solid, Czech-made cannons nestled in concrete casements a few miles inland from the stretch of coastline the Allies would soon codename Omaha. From his observation post, a concrete bunker sunk into a high bluff, he had a commanding view of the sea. Day after day, he and his men drilled. They calculated firing solutions, maintained their guns, and stared out at the gray, empty water. The talk among the men was always of der Tag X, the day of days, the invasion. But when would it come? And more importantly, where? German intelligence, the OKW, was certain the main attack would come at the Pas de Calais, the shortest point across the Channel. It was the logical, military textbook choice. That's where the bulk of Germany's strength in the West, the formidable 15th Army, was dug in and waiting. Normandy was considered a sideshow, a possible spot for a diversionary raid, but certainly not the main event. This was a massive, catastrophic strategic miscalculation, and it was no accident. It was the brilliant, carefully orchestrated result of the most successful deception campaign in military history, Operation Fortitude. By creating an entirely phantom army in southeast England under the command of the famous General George S. Patton, Allied counterintelligence had completely fooled the German High Command, leaving the defenders of Normandy dangerously exposed and outnumbered. Richter's unit, the 352nd Infantry Division, was better than most in the area, but it was still just a shadow of the elite forces that had conquered France 4 years earlier. It was a patchwork division, a mix of seasoned, hard-bitten veterans from the Eastern Front like himself, and a larger number of very young teenage conscripts and older Ost reservists. They were brave and they were dutiful, but they were not the stormtroopers of 1940. They were defenders, tasked with holding a line that was stretched far too thin. The Atlantic Wall itself was more of a patchwork than a solid wall. In many sectors, the great bunkers were incomplete. The minefields had gaps. The vast distances between strong points meant that even a powerful position could be isolated and bypassed. Richter knew this. He had seen the shortcuts local French farmers still used to cross the fields, the blind spots in the interlocking fields of fire his own guns were supposed to cover. He harbored a professional skepticism about their chances against a truly determined, large-scale assault.
In the weeks leading up to June, the tension had been a living thing. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had been tasked with improving the defenses, and he had been a whirlwind of activity. He ordered millions of mines and thousands of jagged steel obstacles, which the men called Rommelspergel, Rommel's asparagus, to be placed on the beaches, designed to impale landing craft at high tide. Rommel, a master of mobile warfare, understood a brutal truth that the High Command in Berlin seemed to ignore. If the Allies weren't defeated on the beaches, in the surf, within the first 24 hours, the war in the West would be lost. Allied air power, he knew, would shred any German reinforcements trying to move to the coast. The first day was the only day that mattered. But on June 5th, the weather turned. A violent storm blew in, with gale-force winds and rough, churning seas. The German Meteorological Office confidently predicted an invasion would be impossible for days. This forecast allowed many senior German officers to relax. It was why Rommel himself wasn't even in France. He had gone home to Germany for his wife's birthday, confident the storm would keep them safe. So as Oberleutnant Richter stood his watch in the pre-dawn chill of June 6th, the mood was routine. The storm had passed, but the sea was still choppy. No one expected a thing. He was looking east when he first saw it, a flicker. He raised his powerful Zeiss binoculars and focused. His heart, which had been beating in the slow, steady rhythm of a long night watch, began to hammer against his ribs. It wasn't a flicker, it was ships. Not a patrol, not a raiding party. Hundreds of them, and behind them more, and behind them more still. He swept his binoculars left and right across the entire visible horizon. Everywhere he looked, it was the same. The sea was no longer gray water. It was a solid geometric mass of dark, menacing shapes. He felt a cold physical dread creep up his spine. It was the feeling of a man looking at a math problem he could not possibly solve. For a long moment, Richter just couldn't process it. The sheer, colossal scale of it was an insult to logic. German intelligence had estimated the Allies might muster 3,000 vessels for an invasion, and even that was considered a monumental effort. What he was looking at was something else entirely. He tried to count, but it was a fool's errand. His brain, on instinct, began to categorize. He could make out the hulking, powerful silhouettes of battleships and cruisers. He saw swarms of smaller, faster destroyers circling them like wolves. And then there were the others, the endless, uncountable others. Landing craft of all shapes and sizes, packed so densely they looked like iron filings drawn to a magnet. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The image didn't change. It only grew clearer as the sun began its slow climb. The official number for the entire D-Day operation would later be confirmed at nearly 7,000 vessels, an armada from 8 different nations. It remains the largest amphibious invasion force in human history. But to Richter, it wasn't a statistic. It was a physical presence that seemed to bend the very horizon under its weight. It was a declaration of industrial power so immense that it made everything he had ever known about warfare feel obsolete.
Germany had built a wall of concrete. The Allies had responded by building a bridge of steel. He grabbed the field telephone, his hand slick with a sudden sweat. "This is Richter at Observation Post 4. I have a visual on the channel. There are ships." The voice on the other end was tired, dismissive. "We have reports of a few ships, Oberleutnant. A possible raid. Stand by." "No." Richter's voice was strained, urgent. "You don't understand. It's not a few ships. It is thousands. The entire sea is covered from horizon to horizon. This is it. This is the invasion." There was a pause. Disbelief. Richter could almost hear the man picturing him as a hysterical junior officer spooked by shadows. "Oberleutnant, the sea conditions are not suitable. Our reports show—" Richter shouted, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and frustration. "I am looking at it with my own eyes. For God's sake, look at the sea!" He slammed the phone down. It was a truth too big to be believed. He tried another line to regimental headquarters and finally found his commanding officer. "Richter here, sir. The invasion fleet is here. 10,000 ships." He knew he was exaggerating, but in that moment it felt like an understatement. The major's voice was skeptical. "Richter, are you certain? The weather. The weather is clear enough to see the end of the world, Major, and it is sitting in the English Channel, requesting permission to open fire." This time the urgency cut through the fog of disbelief. The German chain of command was paralyzed by a failure of imagination. Their plans, their maps, their intelligence reports, all of it was being erased by the impossible reality floating a few miles away. While Richter was watching the fleet, the High Command was focused on reports of Allied paratroopers landing inland, assuming they were the main event. No one was looking at the sea. Richter didn't wait for them. He shouted orders to his men. Roused by the commotion, they stared out from their positions, their faces a mixture of awe and raw terror. They saw what he saw. The drills were over. This was real. The heavy shells were brought up from the magazines. Rangefinders called out numbers that seemed impossibly large. The giant barrels of the cannons, silent for so long, elevated slowly, pointing their noses toward the impossible fleet. The order finally came just before 6 a.m. Engage at will. For Richter, it was a release. The paralysis of disbelief was broken by the familiar clarity of action. "Fire!" he roared into the telephone. A moment later, the ground trembled as the first gun fired. Then a second and a third. The shells screamed out over the water. He tracked them through his binoculars, a surge of professional pride mixing with his dread. He saw plumes of water erupt in the midst of the fleet. A miss, then another. His men were good. They adjusted their aim, firing with a disciplined rhythm, and for a brief, glorious moment they made their mark. He saw a direct hit on an American destroyer, the USS Curie. There was a flash of orange and a puff of black smoke. While some accounts suggest the ship may have also struck a mine, from Richter's perspective, his guns had drawn first blood as the ship listed, crippled, and later began to sink. A cheer went up from his men. For a few minutes it felt like a real battle. It felt like their training mattered. But the feeling was fleeting. Because after the Curie was hit, the fleet did not scatter. It didn't slow down. The gap in the formation was simply filled. The endless lines of ships kept coming, an iron tide that could not be stopped. His guns fired again and again, but for every one ship they might harass, 100 sailed past untouched. Richter felt a profound, soul-crushing sense of futility wash over him. He was a man with a bucket trying to empty the ocean. He looked past his own shell impacts and saw the larger picture. The Allied battleships, ships like the USS Tanks and USS Arkansas, were now turning their massive 14-inch guns toward the shore. Then came The reply. It started as a low rumble from across the water. He saw flashes of light from the big ships, like a silent lightning storm on the horizon. A few seconds later, the air around him began to tear itself apart. The ground began to heave. Geysers of earth erupted from the fields around his bunker. The systematic, industrial process of dismantling the Atlantic Wall had begun. Where was the German response? Where were the Panzers? Where was the Luftwaffe? Richter scanned the skies and saw nothing but Allied planes, fighters, bombers, transports. They owned the air completely. German doctrine called for immediate, powerful armored counterattacks, but the closest armored unit, the 21st Panzer Division, was paralyzed by confusion and the need for a direct order from Hitler's headquarters as Hitler slept. When it finally did move, it moved without air cover into a sky black with Allied fighter bombers, and it was decimated before it even reached the front. It was in that moment, with his own guns firing into an endless sea and the sky raining steel upon him, that Oberleutnant Richter understood the fundamental truth of the day. This wasn't a fight, it was an extermination. The Allies weren't trying to outmaneuver him, they were trying to erase him. As the naval bombardment intensified, something in Richter's mind shifted. The tactical part of his brain, the part concerned with range and trajectory, shut down. It was replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. He was no longer seeing ships and soldiers. He was seeing the system behind them. He was seeing the factories. Through his trembling binoculars, he looked past the warships and saw, in his mind's eye, the roaring assembly lines of Detroit and Michigan. He pictured factories churning out trucks, jeeps, and engines on a scale Germany could only dream of. The logistics of this invasion, the ability to supply hundreds of thousands of men on a hostile shore, wasn't a miracle. It was a simple, brutal result of that industrial output. He looked at the sky, filled with an endless stream of C-47 transport planes and P-47 fighter bombers. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe would fly maybe 300 sorties in all in France. The Allies would fly over 14,000. For every one German plane in the sky, there were more than 40 Allied ones. The reason wasn't a failure of German courage. It was a failure of German factories. And then there were the tanks. He knew the fearsome reputation of the German panzers. The Tiger and the Panther were technologically superior, feared by every Allied crew. But that superiority was a strategic dead end. They were complex, over-engineered, expensive, and difficult to produce. For every fearsome Tiger tank that rolled off the line, the Allies were stamping out dozens of simpler but brutally effective Sherman tanks. In the entire year of 1944, the United States alone would produce over 29,000 tanks. Germany's peak monthly production, by contrast, never topped 2,000. The Allies weren't planning to win tank battles through quality. They were planning to bury the Panzers under a mountain of steel. This was the new reality. This was the industrial equation of defeat. All the talk of willpower, of ideological strength and racial superiority dissolved in the face of these numbers. Nazi ideology had promised that a unified, determined people could triumph over decadent democracies. But here was the proof that ideology couldn't stop a bomber. Willpower couldn't sink a battleship. Richter felt a profound, almost spiritual despair. He and his men were good soldiers. They were about to die, not because they were outfought, but because they were outnumbered on a scale that defied comprehension. They were participants in a contest that was already over before the first shot was fired. He and his men, the entire German army in the West, were like a finely crafted sword facing a steam-powered drop hammer. The outcome of the contest was never in doubt. He thought of the propaganda posters and the unshakable belief back home in final victory. It was all a lie. Not just a political lie, but a mathematical one. The German High Command must have known this. They must have seen the production charts. Yet they had sent him and millions of others to fight a war they could not possibly win. It's no wonder that in the war's final year, the psychological strain and the confrontation with this impossible truth led to a rise in suicides among officers on the front lines. They weren't just fighting soldiers from America, Britain, and Canada. They were fighting the full, unrestrained power of the global industrial complex.
As the sun climbed higher, the theoretical became a brutal reality. The naval bombardment reached a crescendo, a constant rolling thunder that never ceased. The concrete of his bunker shuddered, dust raining from the ceiling. Through the observation slit, Richter saw the first waves of landing craft hit the shore. Higgins boats dropped their ramps, disgorging American soldiers into the surf. The machine guns in the German pillboxes along Omaha Beach began to chatter, tearing into the ranks of the first men ashore. From his vantage point, Richter could see the terrible drama unfold, the water turning red, the bodies piling up. The German 352nd Infantry Division was exacting a horrific price. For a moment, it seemed the defense was holding. The Americans were pinned down, being slaughtered at the water's edge. But then, the industrial equation asserted itself again. Allied destroyers, seeing the slaughter, did something suicidal and heroic. They steamed directly towards the shore, some closing to within 1,000 yards, scraping their hulls on sandbars. They turned their guns on the German bunkers, providing direct, point-blank fire support in a move that turned the tide on Omaha. At the same time, strange new machines began to appear. Richter watched as amphibious trucks, the Dukes, seemingly drove directly out of the ocean and onto the beach. He saw tanks crawling ashore, some equipped with giant spinning flails to detonate mines. These were Hobart's funnies, specialized armored vehicles the British had developed to overcome exactly these kinds of defenses. The Germans had nothing like them. The scene on the beach below turned from a desperate struggle into a methodical process of annihilation. German strongpoints were systematically blinded and destroyed by naval shells, tank rounds, and bombs. On Omaha Beach alone, the 352nd Division would suffer somewhere around 1,200 casualties that day, a staggering percentage of its fighting force wiped out in a matter of hours. Richter's own battery was now a prime target. Shells landed closer and closer. A direct hit on one of the gun pits sent a fireball into the air. Another gun was knocked out. His telephone lines went dead. He was isolated, his command shattered. He looked up at the sky one last time. It was a moving ceiling of Allied aircraft. On the sea, the first wave of landing craft was being replaced by a second and a third. Beyond them, the vast armada waited patiently, a conveyor belt of men and materiel that could, it seemed, run forever.
The Allies would land around 1,500 tanks on D-Day alone. The battle for the beach was still raging, but the outcome had already been decided. It was just a matter of time and tonnage. The war in Normandy would rage for another 2 months. The fighting in the hedgerows would be brutal and costly, but it would change nothing. Every German tank destroyed was a loss that could not be replaced. Every Allied tank lost was replaced by 3 more. Every German soldier who fell left a gap in the line that could not be filled. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, and for the thousands of German soldiers who survived that first day, the rest of the war was just an epilogue. They fought on, driven by duty, by fear, or by a patriotism disconnected from reality. But the hope of victory was gone. It had vanished in the dawn light of June 6th. We often picture the end of the Third Reich as a slow, agonizing collapse culminating in the battle for Berlin. But for the men on the Atlantic Wall, the end came in a single, horrifying moment of revelation. It was the moment they saw a fleet that filled the horizon, a sky blackened by enemy planes, and a force that was not just an army, but the full, crushing weight of the modern industrial world. It was a new kind of war, one won not in the hearts of soldiers, but on the assembly lines of factories thousands of miles away. And for one German officer, peering through his binoculars at a sea that had turned to steel, it was the morning he knew his world had ended.